In this episode of the Orange Nerd Show, I am joined by Evan and the Italiano. We are talking all about Pete Docter, his history with Pixar, our favorite Pete Docter films, the future of Pixar, his era at Pixar versus John Lasseter's era. We have a lot to dive into on this episode of the Orange Nerd Show. Welcome aboard, everybody, to another episode of the Orange Nerd Show. Here on the Orange Nerd Show, we talk about everything except the theme parks. So we talk a lot of studio, Marvel, Star Wars. We do a lot of corporate stuff too, like the CEO succession plan and all that stuff. So today we're talking all about Pete Docter. He's been heavily in the news lately, especially because of Inside Out 2. But before we dive into our topics, George, welcome back, sir.
Thank you very much. So glad to be back, and so glad to have Evan back on. It's been a while since I've been on the show with him. I know he's been making some appearances on the channel and our subsequent channel of like Story Geeks and stuff. So so glad to have him on, and it's going to be an interesting topic. We'll dive into some Pete Docter.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you can let everybody at home know where they can find you on social media, George.
Absolutely. You can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Disney George. You could also find me on Instagram under the Disney Italiano. And of course, you can find me right here on my home base at Orange Grove 55 with Citrus Corner with all that sweet, juicy, but sometimes sticky Disney news and info.
There he is. And Evan, welcome back, sir. It's good to see you.
Thanks. Glad to be back once again. I had so much fun talking about the Inside Out 2 box office, the previews, like all the stuff leading up to like this big juggernaut that we are now witnessing. That is Inside Out 2. And I'm glad to talk about the previous Pixar movies today with Pete Docter's legacy, his history, and how that kind of changed over time in the future of Pixar. I was doing some research before the podcast yesterday and today. I'm just like, okay, there's some interesting things to dive into here in terms of the different eras of Pixar here. But yeah, I'm glad to be back. This is just a fascinating topic. And you guys can find me on Twitter at HarrisEV9. Talking all things anime, movies, TV. I talk about it all. I'm on a variety of other podcasts that I'll talk about later as well.
Awesome. And I will be linking all of Evan's, his links and all the information down below. So make sure you follow him on all those platforms and show Evan some love. Again, it's all in the description down below. All right, so let's dive right in. So George, this was actually your idea. I'll start with yours first because it was in regards to Pete Docter's early career starting at Pixar. So I figure that's a great place to kind of start off as a jumping point. Now, I'm honestly not as familiar with his early days at Pixar. I'll go ahead and let you take the lead and we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually kind of going all the way back, Pete Docter was born in Bloomington, Minnesota. And,
we're going that far back?
Yeah, I'm going to go that far back. Yeah.
Okay.
So growing up, he was he would love to go to like certain like parts in his neighborhood and act out like certain scenes from his favorite films, such as Indiana Jones. He loved playing the role of Indy and what have you. And then he got into animation and cartooning as years went on because he loved the notion of quote unquote playing God, in the sense of being able to make the characters basically do whatever he wanted them to do. So it was in the control of his own mind and what have you. And it was his influencers were Chuck Jones and of course Walt Disney. He was looking into pursuing a career with Walt Disney Studios Animation. And sure enough, that at the time when he was pursuing for that, that was the time when John Lasseter and Steve Jobs and, they were kind of coming up now with this newer type of animation studios known as Pixar. And John Lasseter went to friend and collaborator, the late Joe Ranft. And he said, if you have any students that you feel would, work well into joining Pixar, because at the time it was a very small studio. You know, it was like coming off the back of working with George Lucas over at Lucasfilm. George didn't know really what to do with it. You know, it was because at the time it was like a computer software company, you know, and they wanted to get into animation. That was something Lucas didn't want to do, you know, moved on and what have you. And so Joe Ramp recommended Pete Docter because he was his teacher at Cal Arts. And so he brought Pete Docter on to meeting John Lasseter, and he became part of the original team with Pixar, starting off with a lot of the Pixar shorts, and then which eventually led to the partnership with Walt Disney Studios, or the Walt Disney Company, I should say, and which led to the creation of Toy Story.
Fascinating. And Pete Docter has, you know, I'm intrigued by this guy because the stuff that this guy comes up with. I mean, like you take a concept like Up, this little kid on an adventure with this Carl. He's like in his 80s or something. You know, this old man in a floating house. Like, who comes up with this stuff? I remember hearing about this movie in the lead up to its release, and I'm like, hey, look, Pixar has a great track record, but how are they going to market this movie? This is kind of crazy, you know? But sure enough, it turned out to be a massive hit, and they hit a total home run with that. But really, really, really creative guy.
Absolutely. And before we go to Evan, just a couple other things I want to touch upon, which I just learned this not too long ago, but even though Pete Docter wasn't interested in music, he didn't have a major in music, he did learn to play the double bass, which he performed with the orchestra for the score of Monsters, Inc. and Up. So when you hear the music playing for Monsters, Inc., the Pete Docter's actually playing along with them.
Wow, that's crazy. That's wild. What's your take on this, Evan?
That's fascinating. Well, I was going to ask George a question. I'm curious. So Walt Disney and Pixar had an early partnership, but Walt Disney didn't creatively overhaul Pixar until like 2006. But were they attached during the 1994 or 5 when Toy Story came out? Like,
so basically what it was is, it was like a partnership that it was. Pixar would do the creative side, Disney would do the distribution side of everything. Right. And it would be under the Disney banner and what have you, but it would still be, you know, Pixar showcasing it. But it was basically, Pixar, you know, creating the product, Disney kind of showcasing it, releasing it. And that's why a lot of times, especially in the early days of Pixar, it really wasn't known as Pixar. It was Disney's Toy Story. It was Disney's A Bug's Life, you know, and then as time went on, it was known as, Disney Pixar's, you know, Toy Story 2. And which was very interesting too with Pete Docter, because I felt like at the time when he created Monsters, Inc., it was at the time where they took a risk with him, because John Lasseter was the only one that directed the first 3 films, Toy Story, A Bug's Life, and Toy Story 2. And Toy Story 2 was supposed to be just a direct-to-video sequel, but Disney believed it had the gusto to be a theatrical release. And basically, everything that was part of Toy Story 2 basically got thrown in the garbage can. And John Lasseter was just coming off of the press tour of A Bug's Life. And he was going to take some time off, you know, for family and everything. But he had to go back into the studio and literally rewrite, rechange everything. And they basically did that over a weekend. And so John Lasseter took over the helm of Toy Story 2. And I mention this because after Toy Story 2, then came Monsters, Inc. So John then had to make the decision to allow a lot of other creatives to say, okay, I'm going to let you take the helm for your stories. And that's when he had Pete Docter, he had Andrew Stanton.
The creative brain trust started to be formed.
Yes. So he put a lot of his faith into Pete Docter, because up until that point, he never directed. He was never a co-director on anything. He did a lot of storyboarding and writing, for the first 3 films, but he never. So basically, Monsters Inc., I feel like, was a bigger spearhead into the company because it was the first film that actually stepped away from Lasseter and allowed another creative to come in and showcase their talents.
Yeah, and what made it so interesting was that, and Monsters Inc. is one of my all-time favorite Pixar movies. Easily, probably still my top 5. Which we'll get into, like my favorite Pete Docter and my not so favorite Pete Docter stuff. But what made it so interesting, like going back and thinking about the history of Pixar and the kinds of films they made early on compared to today, they were very much of the it's not animalistic, but like non-human central characters in a way prior to like Incredibles. Like we have all the Toy Story toys, and then the Monsters and Monsters Inc. Like non-human characters in contrast to Disney, which is always mostly these humanistic characters. But what made it so interesting, and Pixar so interesting, is that these toys, these monsters, all had humanistic characteristics, going to jobs, having like families, like Mr. Potato Head's family, all that kind of stuff. Like you kind of get the semblance of it, that universal appeal that was always and continues to be part of Pixar's legacy.
Yeah, 100%. And the thing I love about like Monsters Inc. especially, like, you're right, they're monsters, but they live very like normal human lives. And like they would name the characters like just regular like people names, like Frank and Bob.
Hey, Frank, yeah, you get off at 5, yeah.
It was pretty clever, this fantastical kind of world, but very real and grounded to relate to the everyday person. It was interesting.
Exactly.
It was very, very interesting.
And it was interesting to me. I'm a huge Studio Ghibli fan. It's my favorite, probably my favorite studio of all time. And Pete Docter is a fan of Studio Ghibli. That's one of his earlier inspirations. And I think Miyazaki / Ghibli overall is very in tune with that same mindset in terms of using like these otherworldly, fantastical characters as their main protagonist, or at other times like their main central setting. And trying to find like a universal topic in the fantasy of it all. I think Ghibli gets more fantastical than Pixar does, but they're still in a world of like super out there imagination that people haven't even thought of yet. Like Totoro, for example, is huge, like imagination, like monsters and fantasy, very similar to what we see with Monsters Inc.
I don't want to digress too far off the topic, but since you brought it up, what is your favorite Studio Ghibli film?
Oh, that's hard. Ghibli overall, I would have to say like Whisper of the Heart or When Marnie Was There.
Okay, interesting.
When Marnie Was There is a recent one. I think like 2012, I think. Not recent.
I think for me, I would have to probably go with Spirited Away.
That's number 2 or 3, yeah.
And because it was my first Studio Ghibli film, I just have a sentimental thing, is Kiki's Delivery Service.
Oh my God, I rewatched that last year, actually. Kiki's one of those movies where it's just like you feel so inspired creatively and just through life after watching that movie. You're like, oh my God, I feel so much better now after watching Kiki. It's such a relatable movie. It's insane.
Now, is Studio Ghibli, is it still like, it's an independent studio, right? Like no big company owns that studio right now?
Correct. Yes.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not like Disney's Studio Ghibli. No, it's just flat out Studio Ghibli.
Perfect. Now, I want to ask you, I'll start with you, George, and then I'll go down to Evan. Well, let's talk about some of our favorite Pete Docter films. All-time favorite, George, what would be your favorite Pete Docter film?
So for me, because this film is actually in my top 3 of Pixar films, and it would have to, it would have
of all time.
Of all time. It would have to be Up.
Oh, okay.
That's my all-time favorite Pete Docter. As you mentioned before, OG, it's like the storyline. You would think, like the concept on paper, you would think, okay, what's this person smoking? To the fact that you can come up with a storyline of an elderly person traveling to South America in his house that's being carried up by hundreds of balloons. And it's like, when you think of that, because I remember seeing the teaser of it, and I just remember seeing the balloons coming up. I'm like, okay. And it shows the sky. And then you see the house connected to it, and you just see this old man sitting on his porch, and he's like looking into the camera, and he says, "How do you do?" or something like that, or "Howdy" or something. And I'm like, okay, this doesn't make any sense, but I'm intrigued.
Right.
And then I see the film, and especially like right out the gate, the like a 15 minute.
Oh man.
Oh my gosh, like it like tears you up, like right in the first thing. It's like, Pixar, what are you doing to me? It's like,
well, this is the kind of thing that if I were to see this, like if I were to read the script, or if I would have seen like, or just the concept of this, right? I would probably say like, this is either going to be the most brilliant thing ever done or the biggest flop ever done. Like there's really no like, with, and that actually, not to get ahead of myself, but Up is my favorite as well, my favorite Pete Docter film. But that's what this is. The idea of this movie was so crazy. It's either going to be absolutely brilliant, or it's going to be, what the hell is this? You know. Now, thankfully, it turned out to be, oh my god, this is brilliant. You know, but just a wild concept. And I'm like, how are they going to market this thing? Like, this is such a unique concept. You know, you take a movie like Toy Story, the cute little toys, very easily marketable. You know, even Monsters Inc., the cute little monster, little, you know, Mike Wazowski, easily you can market that very easily in the parks and what have you. Up though, how do you market an old man and a kid in a flying house? It's crazy.
But really quick, when you mentioned that, like when you said, like when you see it on paper, it could either be really well or a complete disaster. It kind of takes me back to the story you told me. I think it was when you had your internship, and you said you saw like some of the storyboards or something when they were creating SpongeBob.
Oh yeah,
and you said. Like, who's gonna want to watch that?
Yeah. Yeah. So Evan, what happened was, when I was younger, I wanted to get into animation, right?
Yeah.
So we had a family friend who was in the industry. So he got me into a couple different studios for internships when I was young. I think I was like 17 or 18 or something. And so one of those animation houses was Nickelodeon. And so this is back in the day, man. I'm old, you know, but I'm walking through, I'm doing my intern thing, just Xeroxing all day long. And there was like this stand up of this new character, SpongeBob. And I'm like, that thing is so fucking ugly, dude. This thing is
never going to happen.
Yeah, this show is going to flop so hard. Yeah, so my intuition was pretty bad on that one. Pretty bad. But what say you, Evan? So George and I, we're going with Up. What's your favorite Pete Docter film?
I'm going to disappoint you guys. I'm not the biggest Up fan.
Interesting. Okay.
This is interesting for me because I didn't see Up in theaters. I think for me, like in hindsight, like, you know, I like watching a lot of teasers and trailers. Like in hindsight, the teaser for Up is kind of magnificent. It's really much like kind of what George said. It really gets your creative juices thinking and like, how can they possibly do this? So I always was curious about it, but for some reason I never saw it. What was Up, 2009 or something like
2009.
that?
Yeah.
2009. I don't know why I didn't see it. I was around the same age or the good age range for Pixar movies. I just missed out on it. But my ranking for Pete Docter's movies, like the ones that he directed, at least, Monsters Inc. I think is just my favorite. I love Monsters Inc. It's funny. I showed Monsters Inc. to my sixth graders in the last week of school, and they loved it. They love that movie so much. Because sometimes I show them early Pixar movies. I'm like, like Mr. Harris, can you just watch Turning Red again? I'm like, watch some of the older stuff. Anyways,
I can picture you because like putting on Monsters Inc. and if like someone's talking, it's like, shh, this is the good part. I'm trying to watch here. It's like
it takes me forever to get them to watch like old movies. I showed them Spider-Man 2. They're like, oh, I'm so bored. I'm like, are you kidding me? Spider-Man 2? Anyway, I had to go Monsters Inc., Inside Out, Soul, and then Up in terms of the ones that he directed. Inside Out, and Soul are kind of like very tied. Some days I pick Inside Out, some days I pick Soul. I love Soul. But Up for me is very interesting because I love the first 15 to 30 minutes. I think I saw Up about like during the COVID years. I think like in 2020, I finally went to go see Up.
Pretty recent. Wow.
Yeah. I for some reason, I missed out on it and I was never intrigued by it. So yeah, I saw Up, and I think the first act is really strong. For some reason, when they go to South America, that's when I get taken out. Which is the storyline just doesn't do it for me in the last act of the movie. It's pretty much generic, in my opinion. But I do love like the character. I love the beginning of it all. I haven't seen his whole spinoff though, like his first date, something like that. Mm-hmm. I don't think I've seen that one. But Monsters Inc., of course, is like my favorite. It's his OG. It's Pete Docter's OG. But for me, it's just like it's one of the movies I played all the time growing up. Like I love that movie to death. And then of course Inside Out, the sequel came out, and I just rewatched the original last Friday, the day before I went to go see Inside Out 2, and I'm like, oh my god, this movie is just, it's infinitely like remarkable, like how you can create so many sequels. I know Iger's so happy about the success. He's like, fast track Inside Out 3, 4, 5, and 6. Like, come on, we're gonna have geriatric Riley up in here. Like, there's so much potential for this freaking franchise. They can do a whole other kid and do their own family. Like, it's insane. Anyways, yeah,
it's crazy. Now we joked about it, Evan, in a previous video not too long ago. I think it was on Bad Thought Studio actually, where we were talking about how they could even take Andy from Toy Story and have his emotions, and you could have that crossover franchise.
Like, come on, there's so much potential.
Well,
here.
and it's funny that you mentioned like the geriatrics, because it's when we kind of get a little taste of that already in Inside Out 2, and not to give out spoilers, but when you look at one of the emotions, nostalgia, and the fact that they said you don't need to come up yet, it's not time, and she just kind of like walks back. So it's like, it almost throws like a little hint. It's like, okay, are we going to get more sequels, and we're going to watch Riley grow up even more? And it's like, to the fact of that she becomes elderly, and then here comes nostalgia, and it's like,
that would be amazing. Cast Meryl Streep as nostalgia in the next movie. Make her like the antagonist. Like, oh, I miss my whatever so much. It's like, oh shit, like, that could be very fascinating.
Riley's like stuck in the past. She won't let go.
Midlife crisis, the movie.
Exactly. But it's a very brilliant concept, Inside Out. It's a brilliant concept. It's so well executed. And again, it's one of those ideas where it's like, it's kind of like Up, right? Where it's kind of like, how do you do this? How do you make this work for like the masses? And that's one of Pete Docter's, I think, kind of talents, is where he specializes in sort of taking these interesting concepts that are kind of out there and wild, and being able to kind of package them for like the masses in a way that works,
And Pete Docter too. It almost is like when he was in the middle of like creating Inside Out, he almost, well, I'm not going to say almost, I think he did have a Walt Disney moment, because at the time when Walt Disney was making Snow White, when he was developing the dwarfs, he had like a list of like all different like personalities and names that he had to like dwindle it down to just 7. But I think also Pete Docter had the same thing. He had like all these emotions that were like written down. It's like, okay, I got to take it down to at least like 5 or 6, and then actually by making Inside Out 2, I believe the newer emotions were part of the original roster that was like, that had the potential. And I guess that it kind of stuck in his mind to say,
no pun intended.
No pun intended. Yes. That, I could still create some sort of, baseline like storyline with them. And Evan, without like kind of like spoiling it for anyone, but I've noticed too, watching Inside Out 2, and I mentioned this before, I love how it's one storyline, but you basically get kind of 2 separate stories in a sense, based off of the group of emotions. You see joy, you see sadness and anger, and their journey of what they have to do in order to get Riley back to where she's supposed to be mentally. But then you also have the other storyline with anxiety and envy and embarrassment, and how they're already like controlling Riley like as a teenager form. I thought that was quite brilliant.
I thought so too. Just a non-spoiler review in that sense. I really loved Inside Out 2. I think it was remarkable. One of the rare like sequels that Pixar does that's actually as good or close to as good as the first one. The first one has like the novelty aspect being like so brand new, but I think the second one just had as much imaginative creativity in its storyline, and it has like a decently strong emotional storyline, and that emotional storyline really ties into Joy's whole arc in the movie. I think Inside Out 1 had maybe a better Joy arc, but this one, she's like kind of out of her element, and she's facing off against somebody who is very similar to her in anxiety. They both want to help out Riley in these drastically different ways, and that made for a very compelling storyline. And I kind of like that, like anxiety's whole group over there trying to do their best, and then you have Joy trying to do her best, and there's always going to be a middle ground. and trying to find that was very interesting in Inside Out 2. And it's just not spoiler wise, but Maya Hawke as Anxiety was fantastic.
Yes.
One of the best voice acting I've seen all year.
Wow. Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I plan on it. It looks absolutely adorable. But like, I really do appreciate, and maybe this is why when you were saying, George, that all these emotions were sort of planned for the first movie, but then he had to whittle them down. You can kind of get a sense of that because the new emotions fit so seamlessly in with the new characters. It doesn't feel like, and I'll reserve final judgment until when I see it. But at least from what I've seen from like the little various clips that I've seen, and even just aesthetically, the characters seem like they've been part of this franchise since day one. It's kind of remarkable. So.
And a little fun fact to everyone who wants to know, but I'm just throwing out an Italiano fact because I always do. Maya Hawke, who does the voice of Anxiety that Evan had mentioned, is the daughter of actors Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Interesting. So now
nepotism.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So we got to know Pete Docter. We talked about some of his favorite films. He came into his position, leading Pixar. I believe it was like early 2019 or late 2018 when Lasseter left, right?
Yeah.
2018. So he came in around that time. Now, John Lasseter, for all his personal issues and what have you, he was successful by and large with Pixar and what he did, obviously, over in that studio. We're a few years into the Pete Docter era, right? So say 2018. It's now 2024, still kind of new, still kind of fresh. What are your thoughts, Evan, in regards to this Pete Docter era in comparison to the Lasseter era? Is it too soon? Can we even compare right now?
It's so interesting. And I'm going to keep saying that because, when I was doing the research for that question, I'm like, okay, Pete Docter's era is it's very fresh. It's very new. But there is a pattern that we talked about on the other studio in terms of like his personal storytelling that he's really giving a lot of creativity to these directors who are coming up. And I think it's the same thing that Jennifer Lee is doing at Disney Animation as well, in terms of like there's this rise. We're in like the 2020s or getting in there. A lot of the people that grew up watching early Disney, watching early Pixar are now in the creative positions to tell their stories at Pixar and at Disney. And I think we've seen that. I think Pete Docter has allowed these up and coming directors and creatives to showcase their personal lives into the Pixar mainstream in very successful ways. So I think I like seeing stories like a Luca, Turning Red, Soul, really make their way into these kind of movies. And we've also seen very much things that are very similar to what we've had before in terms of creative worlds, like in Inside Out and in Onward as well. So those are also been part of his reign as well. But in contrast, and it's kind of hard to sum up Lasseter's era because like where do you start? Like, he starts at the very beginning because he was involved. He did direct the other Toy Story movies, but he wasn't like the creative head until like 2005, 6 or 7, whatever it was like that. And the early era, arguably because it's just a long stretch, it had more sequels. And I think that kind of goes into Iger of it all, right? Like once you get bought by Disney, Iger's going to want some like, hey, Cars was great. People love Cars at the parks. Give me a Cars 2. Give me a Cars 3. I've never seen Cars 3. I never saw any of the Cars sequels besides Cars 2. So I haven't seen Cars 3.
I'm sorry.
But it's Cars. Which one? Cars 2 I know was like, I remember watching that as a kid, not great.
Basically, Cars 3 I think was quite decent, actually, especially if you're comparing it to Cars 2. You could probably skip number 2. And more so, Cars 3 runs like right into almost where the first film left off. It's a great segue.
Yeah, my friends are always like, this is it's a very surprising Pixar sequel. So I might watch Cars 3 one day. But I didn't really love Monsters University. And then the end of Lasseter's run was Incredibles 2. Now, Incredibles is my favorite Pixar movie. Incredibles 2 was fun. It just didn't live up to like the hype of Incredibles or come anywhere near close. The like the storytelling of the first Incredibles, for me at least. So it's interesting that Lasseter's era gets bogged by some of the sequels, so much so that people are like, is Pixar kind of like out of it a little bit in the 2018 run? The Finding Dory of it all, I forgot that too. So there's a lot of sequels, but there's also a lot of like creative stuff in the beginning and towards the middle. Like there was like an Inside Out. There was like Finding Nemo. All that kind of stuff came under Lasseter. So it started off very creative, but then also there's a lot of sequels as well. So it's kind of a harder balance. But a lot of the personal stuff I really admire from Pete Docter's era.
I'm glad you brought that up, Evan, because I wanted to ask you. I actually agree with you. Like Incredibles 2, Finding Dory, they were okay movies for me, but I prefer the originals, Finding Nemo and the original Incredibles. Actually, The Incredibles is part of my top 5 of all-time Pixar.
I'd be surprised if it wasn't. It's perfect.
And but now, do you think the success of those films, of Finding Dory and The Incredibles 2, for us as being like film and Disney nerds, if you want to call us that we dive deep into the storyline. It's like, okay, the storyline was okay, but for a normie, do you feel like the success of those films, like based off of the box office numbers, it was solely not because of the strongness of the storyline, but it was the characters that were just so familiarized in pop culture? It's like, hey, these characters are back. The first film was great. We got to see the sequel, sort of thing.
I think it's a mix of both. I think most people were okay. And if you have a movie that's built upon nostalgia, that's going to lead to an incredible opening weekend, which Incredibles 2 and Finding Dory had. Like they both had like over 140 million opening weekend. Incredibles 2 had 182 or something.
Wow.
That's built on, hey, we're getting ready to see Jack again and the whole family again. Like that's the appeal. That leads to the opening weekend. And even if the movie is, in my opinion, is just okay or fine, even if most people think that, it's going to lead to strong legs at the box office, and it's going to lead to a successful run. So much so that Iger's going to be like, okay, these are safe bets. If Finding Dory and Incredibles 2 come out and they have those big opening weekends, but then they flop like a Batman versus Superman, for example, which drops like dramatically, people see it and they're not going to go back to see it. If they flopped, then they'd be like, okay, let's stick to what we're doing in terms of our original storytelling. But they didn't. So I think Iger and even Pete Docter were like, okay, these sequels are good. These are safe bets. And it's always fine to do these kind of sequels.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Evan. I think as long as you have a decent movie there, if you have the characters that people love and you have at least a decent movie, it'll do fine. I mean, the Illumination stuff, I don't know how these Despicable Me movies like gross what they do, but it's kind of to that point where it's like people love the Minions, and so you put the Minions in a movie. The movie probably is it's probably a 5, from 1 out of 10 they're probably like a 5.
We have to remember this, and this is a scary thought, and I'm actually going to go back to one of my favorite 1980s movies, The Breakfast Club. This is the thought that has me waking up in the middle of the night. That people, young kids that actually find the Despicable Me films entertaining, here's the thought. These are the people that are going to end up taking care of us.
Yeah. One of these kids will be president one day, right? It's wild. Yeah. It's absolutely wild.
We'll be having Minion Day.
Oh, right. Yeah, right. Exactly.
It's so funny. Like Illumination has so much success, especially in the COVID years, right? Like and like DreamWorks as well. It's like even more so than mainly because Pixar has been idiots and they've been putting their stuff on Disney Plus. But otherwise, it's like they've had so much success, especially with Mario. I was shocked. I mean, Mario is like an iconic, fictional character of all time. But I was just shocked that it's just that much money, like $1.5 billion for Mario. People are going back to see this. Really? I thought it was just. I was falling asleep in the theater. I was like, yeah, it's good, it's cool. I'll go back home and play Super Mario Galaxy. I'm not going to watch the movie again. But no, people loved that movie, and it was astonishing.
Yeah, that's the same thing with me, because I remember I went to go see it twice.
Yeah.
The first time, I didn't care for it. I could honestly say I did not. I went back a second time, and I went from not liking it to liking it. I don't love it. but I like it. I think it'll be very strong moving forward with like future movies. But again, it throws off that Illuminations vibe, and it's like that's what I can't get out of. Is
they have that vibe. I'm just like it's weird.
See, now I kind of depart from you guys a little bit on this one because I actually really liked the Mario movie. I thought the relationship, the brotherly stuff with him and Luigi was really acute, like touching. Yeah, I like that. I
do appreciate your opinion, OG. You're wrong, but I appreciate it.
But it was a cute. It's actually the only Illumination movie I've ever liked. I'm with you guys on that. I typically don't like Illumination movies. I find them kind of obnoxious for by and large, But Mario was like the one exception for me. But
I do want to mention too, because Evan mentioned about like with Disney and Pixar releasing everything on Disney Plus like more sooner than later,
right?
And I kind of want to retract my statement that I've been saying, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. And when I said, Inside Out 2 is Pixar's comeback, so to speak. As far as box office numbers goes, yes. But really, is it really actually Pixar's comeback? I don't think so.
Let's talk about this. I agree.
Yeah.
Man. I agree.
Let's talk about exactly, because I really want to discuss this because Docter came in 2018, late 2018, I believe, right? So a little over a year after he came in, the pandy hit, and it completely, shook everything up. And these movies that were slated for theaters, like even Onward, it had like a 2-week run before the theaters got shut down.
It was one of the last movies. That's a good point. Yeah, it was like one of those last March 2020 movies where it's just like...
I actually went to go see it in theaters. I saw it the day, 1 week to the day, when the world just went completely bonkers, literally. And I never would have thought it. And it was the last movie I saw in 2020 in theaters.
Yeah, and so all these movies, Soul, which I agree with you, Evan, I love Soul, Turning Red, and there were all these movies that Pixar was forced to sort of throw on Disney Plus because that was like the corporate mandate, and then with the pandemic, the whole thing. And it's like, I feel like it's kind of unfair. I see a lot of comparisons like, Pete Docter isn't really performing for Pixar, the way Lasseter did. I'm like, well, Lasseter didn't have a 100-year pandemic and all his movies thrown on a streaming service. Like,
I guarantee you,
if Doctor's reign has been on streaming, that's not fair to compare,
Exactly. If they were to put movies like Soul and Luca, if they had their original theatrical release, they would have been just as success as the Lasseter era films. I guarantee it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've heard that Luca merchandise sells really good at the parks. I mean, people like those characters. Go ahead, Evan.
It's astonishing to me. Like this whole, the media loves this. They love a good comeback story. Like the summer movie theaters, like what's happening? People aren't going to go to the movies in the summertime. What's happening? Furiosa's flopping. Oh, thank you, Bad Boys. Thank you, Inside Out 2. It's like, this happens every effing summer. It's like, what are we doing? It's like people just didn't like Furiosa. Shocker. Like people just didn't like a Fall Guy. It's like, okay, people are allowed to not be interested in movies. I'm disappointed. I think Furiosa's amazing. But it's like, okay, people don't like these movies. It doesn't mean the sky is falling and that like Inside Out saving theaters. I mean, it kind of is and it isn't. But that's a whole other thing. But yeah, and then I agree. Pixar hasn't really left. I looked it up. The number one streaming movie of 2021 was Luca. People love Luca. Luca was the number one. And then in 2022, the number 2 movie was Turning Red. People loved watching Turning Red on streaming. They were very successful. Yes, I think they would have been just as successful in theaters. But even without that, it wasn't like people were crapping on Luca and Turning Red. They were very popular on social media. I know social media is not everything. But when the pandemic hit, I mean, what else are you going to have?
And really, honestly, speaking of Turning Red, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of that movie. However, in my household, I always say, it's best to try something twice. And unfortunately, I have only watched Turning Red once. I really should watch it one more time just to kind of see like where my headspace is at. But just overall, the merch, the characters, I mean, people go nuts for it, especially in the parks. And actually, I do have to say, there's one aspect of Turning Red I do like, and it's actually the music, because they played like this outro music that's part of the Together Forever. I always forget the two, like which one's the parade and which one's the fireworks. The Together Forever fireworks, and it has like this nice like kind of beatbox kind of like beat to it at the end of the fireworks. And someone told me it was from Turning Red.
Yeah,
and I'm like, I'm actually kind of like digging that. I like that.
Yeah, I really wonder if your mind would change. Do you watch Turning Red again? I've seen it twice now, and I really love Turning Red. And it's one of the more like rewatchable and fascinating and relatable Pixar movies. I mean, all Pixar movies are relatable in some ways, but I was having a blast watching Turning Red. I actually like it a bit more than Luca. Even though I think Luca is very strong as well.
Now it's interesting, Evan. You brought up an interesting point here with like 2 weeks ago, people thought theaters were dead, right? Now theaters are back, right?
We're back,
right? And it kind of reminds me of like the there was this narrative for a long time, and George and I talked about this recently in a show, or maybe it was with Seymour. We were talking about like the anti-woke crowd or whatever was spinning this narrative for years. Families are avoiding Pixar movies because of woke messaging, and they're staying out. They're not watching these Pixar things because they're worried it might have some woke thing in there for their kids, and they got to wait to watch it first before the.
What do I tell my kids? Oh my god!
Oh my god! And then Inside Out comes out. It makes like $1.5 billion. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. What happened to pre-screening these movies? The pre-sales were through the roof for this fucking thing. Like all that narrative down the toilet.
And I just have to just say something. I have to. I'm sorry. These same people and parents that say, oh my gosh, how could you let your child watch these woke Disney and Pixar films? It's like, okay, what's your child doing right now? Oh, they're in their room playing Halo. I'm
right. Watch out, mother. Beep, beep, beep. Yeah. It's like, yeah, come on. And let's not play it around. Like, this is still Disney's Pixar. What's their definition of woke in the first place? Like, Luca could have been a lot more like out there and not subversive with their like messaging. Like, people can think of those two characters as gay,
exactly,
or as best friends,
right?
Like,
exactly.
Disney, they're not going to flat out do anything. In fact, Disney usually shies away from that. They're very much a conservative company. Like, come on.
The term woke has not one definition. Each person can have their own interpretation of what woke is. I could watch something and say, oh, that to me seems woke. You could watch that same scene and say, George, what the hell are you talking about? Like,
I remember seeing, not only does woke change from person to person, it changes from weekend to weekend, depending on the box office, because I remember all these channels and all this narrative that Barbie was woke. It was I'm sure you guys remember this on Twitter.
Of course. Oh yeah.
The wokest thing that Hollywood has ever done. But the minute that movie dropped and started to make $1.5 billion, like Inside Out 2 did, suddenly it wasn't woke anymore. Isn't that funny? You didn't hear anything about it.
How did that happen? How did that become so successful where every quadrant in America is watching these movies? But yeah, the whole narrative that Pixar is back, like they've been back. Turning Red has more of a positive, I mean, granted, just Rotten Tomatoes, but like Turning Red's a 95 Rotten Tomatoes, which is pretty much the norm for most Pixar movies, that 90% range. Luca has a 91, just like Inside Out 2 has a 91 Rotten Tomatoes. They're both very well critically received. The only difference is box office potential. And the only thing is Luca and Turning Red weren't at the box office. But I think Pixar hasn't really left. And even as recently as Elemental, which was like their one thing last year, right? Just Elemental?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Even then, that wasn't their most well-received film, but it had great legs. People kept going back to see it. Why? Because it was more than okay. I think it was a very strong movie with a very good war footing.
And I think Elemental had those long legs because people thought it was going to fall under the same path as Soul, as Luca, as Turning Red. It's like, oh yeah, why should we pay to go into the theater when it's just going to end up on Disney Plus? But when they realized that this movie was going to stick around a little longer, and it's like, okay, so we should kind of, go see this in theaters because that's what kind of stretched out the leg point. But I will say, I feel like Elemental would have done so much better if Pixar would have marketed a little bit better and promoted.
Marketing was trash. I mean, let's not like mince words here. Why are they marketing that one boy who was flirting with Ember? I'm like, why are you marketing that kid over there? And then you're not marketing the romance. This is one of the most romantic Pixar movies, and the romance is hardly even mentioned. They're mentioning like the awkward nature of the water guy. I forget his name.
Wade.
Wade, yeah. They're mentioning how awkward Wade is and how expansive the world is. People are so used to expansive Pixar worlds, that's not going to get butts in seats. But I think the romance of it all could have been more highly like marketed. It's just weird they didn't even do that. It's kind of weird, like even outside of Pixar, they don't even market musicals anymore because people are afraid of musicals. It's like, no, people want to go see certain things. Just don't be afraid to market your freaking movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Elemental was a wash. I was like, the marketing, it didn't get me interested, but I was like going to go see it because it was one of the only things out that one weekend, and it was good. I saw it twice. I really loved Elemental.
Yeah, I actually slept on that movie, and I actually only watched it because we were doing a story geek for Jay, and you know Jay, he comes in, he dives deep, so I had to come prepared, so I watched it, and I'm sitting there watching it, and I'm like, this is really good. It's an immigrant story. It's a beautiful love story. It's great. This is fantastic. And then I kind of understood, okay, this is why this movie had legs, because it really is a good movie, and
So. Yeah, it's not the most perfect thing in the world, but it's very fun. It's relatable. It's sweet. And I had a good time watching it. Again, I can see why it had good legs at the box office. But yeah, again, it has, like you mentioned, it talked about that immigrant story, that personal relationship, which again, I think is a trademark of Pete Docter's era so far. Like the whole immigrant nature of Elemental was very close to the director's past. I forget the director's name right now.
Peter Song,
directly in terms of his relationship to his own parents and what they did for him growing up. And then same thing for Turning Red, that coming of age narrative. Oh, and speaking of coming of age, like, in terms of the whole Pixar is back stuff, I find it so funny that they're like, Pixar is back. Inside Out 2 is revolutionizing, puberty and how Riley's going through puberty. Everybody's like, Turning Red just happened 2 years ago. It's very much a coming of age, puberty-esque storyline about a young girl. Inside Out 2 isn't doing it differently. It's just doing something unique, and there's a different. I just find that very funny as well. It's like, come on, guys, reference Turning Red. It was successful. But yeah, Turning Red, like coming of age stuff. But even outside of being coming of age, there's the Chinese American influence of it all in the early 2000s. It was a very unique standpoint. And I really like that aspect of Turning Red. And then for Luca as well, like the director even mentioned, I think it was Enrico, even mentioned like, oh yeah, that was about him growing up with his best friend and how his best friend really helped him express himself when he was younger and be more creative and be more open. And that's kind of like what we saw with Luca. So these personal stories and these people who are writing stories that mean so much to themselves and getting that out there in a more relatable, universal way has always been a trademark of Pixar, but I think we're seeing it in spades here under Pete Docter's era here.
Yeah, well said. And it's kind of cool. Like a movie like Turning Red plays to like that Asian storytelling or whatever, but it's something that like you don't have to necessarily be Asian to relate to that story of like that relationship with your mother and like you were saying, like the coming of age and the puberty stuff. That's any young woman can see themselves in that. You know what I'm saying? Can relate to that. So it's awesome. It really is awesome. And I do like that element of Pete Docter's story of his leadership with Pixar, that he is going in for that kind of thing. I feel like the Lasseter era, like you touched upon, Evan, was a lot of like, we're going to take like inanimate objects or things or animals and then just make them human, which is cool. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it necessarily, but I like the more cerebral take, the more personal take that Pete Docter has taken the studio in since he took over. So I don't know.
For sure.
And it's also a great way to not repeat yourself. You know, it's like you want to have a different variety of stories. You know, why should it only be, subdued to just like one type of story based, kind of storyline plot, and it's like, so I like that there's a variety. You could watch a movie like Monsters Inc., or you could watch a film like Finding Dory, or even The Good Dinosaur. You could watch movies like that. I mean,
I've never seen Good Dinosaur. Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's like, okay, I thought it was really adorable. I think it's a cute movie, but it's not Pixar's best by any means. But it's a cute movie. I mean, if you check it out on Disney Plus, you'll probably get, you're not going to be bored, but it's not, it's not like,
which actually, as I said to OG on the phone, that I would, they went through so many
Oh, they had
different
issues.
levels of that film, like in and out. Like they went through like 3 different scripts. They went like it was in like production for so long that they just didn't know what to do with it. So you can kind of see it in the final the final piece. But yeah, as I said, it's a cute movie. You know, it's not like my all-time favorite, but as I was saying, but then you have, as what Evan was saying, you have like those coming of age stories. You have Luca, you have Turning Red, you have Soul. So you have more of those realistic films where it's animated, but at the end of the day, when you go and see those movies, you can find a character in yourself, and it's like, I can relate to that. I could see myself in that character. I could see that character in me.
Absolutely.
And because we're talking about this Pete Docter era, I want to discuss some of the hindrances. I think we talked about this in one of the other podcasts before. But Pete Docter, like I said, he's giving these directors not carte blanche because he's still creatively involved, obviously, kind of like Kevin Feige. But also, you know, we do unfortunately get movies like Lightyear, which I can't stand. I didn't like Lightyear. I'm also not the biggest fan of Onward either. And I think, I don't want to say he's giving directors too much control, because that's never really mostly a bad thing. But it's happened where we're getting a lot of these relatable movies, but sometimes like Lightyear slips through the cracks where it's just not following the Pixar creed. And I think if we're following the discussion of like what should Pete Docter listen to moving forward, he should not be against movies like Luca, Turning Red, his personal storytelling, because we'll get to those comments. But like, he should be focusing on benefiting from Luca, Turning Red, Inside Out too, instead of being afraid of them, and be more so looking at what Lightyear did wrong, what Onward might have done wrong as well. Onward had, again, it was like in theaters and then in streaming, but also critically, Onward didn't do that well either. But I think Lightyear and Onward both have the thing where it's just like, for me at least, not relatable. Onward is more relatable because it has like that sibling relationship, which anybody can kind of get into. But the world building in Onward was very messy, in my opinion. And same thing for Lightyear, where they're trying to rely on the world building of Toy Story, even though Lightyear is more so just a sci-fi movie. And in my opinion, not really aimed at kids or the whole family aspect. There's no familial, universal storytelling in Lightyear. It's just...
And speaking of Lightyear, like of how they kind of started that movie out of saying, you know, this is the movie that Andy watched that inspired him to purchase the figure. And I'm like, and after I watched this thing, I'm like, this is the thing that inspired Andy to want to have a Buzz Lightyear action figure. Like, this would inspire me not to have one.
Well, and that's the problem.
Right.
That's my issue with the movie, is that it's beautifully animated and all that, but it's so dystopian and like too glum, or, you know, and it's, I don't know, it doesn't match. Like, I want a fun movie, like a fun Buzz Lightyear movie, like to match the energy, like what you were saying, George, of Andy being excited about the toy. This movie is like not it.
And especially with the identity of Zurg and everything, it just didn't like make sense to me that it was like,
oh god,
Buzz Lightyear like under the mask, and it was like he was basically fighting himself. And I'm like,
they were trying to do like the "I'm your father" thing and sort of like do that plot twist thing at the end or whatever, and it just
like, this is who you could become in the future if you keep going down this path.
Yeah,
like, it's not hitting. Like, the story was not hitting at all. The execution was terrible. I did like kind of most of the first act. I think it was the way he kept kind of looping and stuff like that. That was kind of interesting. Had some interesting concepts, but Lightyear just all over the place. And similar to Elemental, marketed badly. So it could be a trend for Pete Docter to think about in terms of how do you market these new Pixar movies. I'm kind of getting nervous, and I'm kind of excited for Elio in terms of like, this is a brand new original Pixar movie. I hope, and hopefully they market it better than they did the last one in Elemental. We'll have to wait and see.
What worries me about Elio is this movie has been on the back burner for so long that this would now fall into the time area of its conception at the time where they were kind of like transitioning like leadership, and animators were all over the place. So I just hope that whatever final product we get out of Elio, people are going to say, oh, They screwed it up again. They messed it up. But it's like, no, well, this movie has been put on the back burner for like how many years? This is a film that we're getting that was basically made how many years ago?
What do you think Elio started? Did it start in the 2019 era?
It started...
Because I remember seeing previews about this at a D23.
I did too. They showed previews of it in 2022. They gave us a sneak preview of it, but I remember them announcing it. I think it was even 2 years prior to that. They didn't show no teaser or anything, but they announced it. I think it was in 2029. So this has been like a 5-year kind of project because it was supposed to be released
this year,
and it got delayed another whole year.
Yeah, the pandemic sort of put them, kind of gummed up the works, and then also you had Chapek's involvement in a lot of that. So yeah, it's an issue. Hopefully they're able to iron this stuff out and continue, because Inside Out's a massive success. Inside Out 2. The next one, Elio, being an original, I want to kind of continue that momentum for Pixar.
My other worry with Elio is it's a space movie, and I don't know what it is with animated space films, especially coming from Disney or Pixar. It could be a hit or miss. Now with WALL-E, for me, that was a success.
That was a good one, yeah.
That was a great one. But like when you take movies like Lightyear, or you take
like Strange World or something.
Strange World, Mars Needs Moms.
I hated Strange World.
it's always like a hit or miss kind of thing.
Yeah,
especially the animation for Strange World, like that. Like it just there's like just so much with Strange World. It's like, oh god,
what were they thinking? Like, how did this get from pencil to screen? I'm like, this movie just not. I'm a huge Jake Gyllenhaal fan. That was like the only reason I went to go see Strange World. I was like, oh, Jake Gyllenhaal's involved. I'll go see it, even though the movie doesn't look good. And like once again, it was marketed terribly. Like, what movie is this? They're just going into a strange world, and that was it.
Yeah.
Not great.
Yeah, it wasn't great. Now I want to dip into some of these comments.
Let's do it.
We got a couple quotes here. This is interesting. So this is from Entertainment Weekly, but it says here, this is a fascinating quote from Pete Docter. It says here, I'm glad you brought up box office because there was a lot of talk when Elemental was released in theaters. What do you define for Pixar as success versus failure? To me, Elemental was a success because it made money over time. And this is what Pete Docter said. He goes, I think it's defined as a success for Disney now. But the first few weeks, because we were playing by the rule book of 5-10 years ago, we were like, quote, this is a disaster open to so small a number. Everybody reported it that way. Even now, we're kind of scratching our heads. Did we market it wrong?
Yes, you did. Yes.
Did people not see it as something that they were interested in? It feels to me like it was word of mouth, so it had a slow build. Maybe that's the way movies go now. I don't know. It's such a tricky thing with what do you call it when it comes out in theaters and then it comes out on streaming. We were looking at other movies on Netflix and stuff. Again, it's the Wild West. Everyone's trying to figure it out. How do we make money? So, Evan, I'll start with you. This is interesting because we kind of do live in a new kind of world here when it comes to like studio success, where it's like you have a movie like Encanto, which didn't really perform that great in the box office, went on to Disney Plus, became a cultural phenomenon with we don't talk about Bruno, the music. I mean, people love that franchise. Encanto is one of Disney's biggest franchises now, and it didn't do well in the box office. What's your take on Pete Docter's sort of admission of like, yeah, we're trying to figure this out?
I think it's something, not just Pete Docter, but I think Marvel, DC, WB, like I think a lot of Disney, they're all trying to figure out what quantifies like success at the box office. It's such a tricky thing living in the post-COVID world where opening weekend is more pronounced than ever. Opening weekend box office has always been a thing. You know, it was what was his name? The guy from Yellowstone, Kevin
Costner.
Kevin Costner. He was talking about it at Cannes in terms of like, it was hard getting my movie Horizon off the ground because, studios are always trying to think about how will it do opening weekend. And it is kind of a hindrance to creatives at the, creative level. And that's what people really think about. They think about opening weekend. And if that does bad, then they might hinder the theatrical, like the number of theaters it can go to. That just recently happened with The Fall Guy, where people are like, oh, this movie flopped like 25 million opening weekend. Let's cut the theaters by like 500 theaters. That kind of crippled it, and then going to streaming also crippled it. But it had legs. People were interested in the movie. So people have to have faith outside of opening weekend. And luckily, Pixar did last year with Elemental, where they didn't cut the number of theaters that drastically, and they saw that slow build. And to answer some of his questions, yes, he did market it wrong. And it turned out people were interested in the movie, but not in the things they were trying to market. Pixar was. It is still kind of tricky. I do not blame them for being at a loss for words in terms of like how to quantify success in this tumultuous marketplace. But it's something people are always trying to figure out here. But again, luckily they kept Elemental in theaters, and it wasn't like huge like box office success still, right? Like it made 500 million. It cost 200 million. So it came over the like break even point, but it's not like they're like swimming in money after Elemental. They just barely broke even. So it's an interesting story.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. What do you think, Italiana?
What he said.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. I feel like not just with Pixar, not just with Disney, echo what Evan said. I feel like all these studios, you try to please as many people as you can because you want to give off an entertaining film that you want people to watch and maybe even come back and see it again and what have you. But at the end of the day, you don't know really which side of the that you're catering to. You could go in and a certain group of people can go in and say this is the greatest movie since Titanic, and it's like, and people can go in and say, oh my God, this is the worst film since Ishtar. It's like you don't know which way you're going, but you just kind of do the best that you can. And I think going into a post COVID world, it's even more stressful on these studios because again, with streaming becoming kind of the forefront of everything, and it's like it's so hard to retract back, and it's like how do you get to that point to get butts into the theaters and again? And unfortunately, I mentioned this before, I feel like it's just how drive-ins used to be. Drive-ins used to be the hot ticket, and it's like they died at death's door with theaters, and now theaters are doing the same, sharing the same fate with streaming services because people, especially like with inflation and the prices with everything now, it's like you're already paying a monthly subscription for these streaming services. And let's be honest, there's so many different films and television shows and specials and documentaries, but they're all not on one streaming service. Sometimes you have to pay multiple subscriptions just to get your feel of what you want to watch. So you're already paying that monthly, and then you're going to pay an extra price on top of it to watch it one time to then say, okay, well, in a couple months, I could be watching it, including with my subscription.
Well, it's hard with animation because I think moviegoers are getting more picky with what they see in theaters, because you have options now. You can watch stuff on your phone, your iPad. You can watch content anywhere and unlimited stuff, right? To choose from, YouTube, everything. So I think people are getting more particular with what they see in theaters. So I don't think the theater industry is dying, but I think it is shrinking. I think there's going to be maybe less movies in theaters. But that's the thing, they're competing for eyeballs. And with animation, it's especially hard because if you have a family of 4 or a family of 5, you're paying an arm and a leg because you got the little ones, you got to get them candy and stuff too. It's a lot of money to do that. So I think when families are looking at it, like with animation, like, do we roll the dice with a new IP, right? Or do we go in for the sure thing, like the Super Mario and the Inside Out? And it looks like they're going for the sure thing, which, right? And that makes me nervous a little bit because I want to see some of these original stuff take off. And you don't make any new franchises if you don't have those originals. But go ahead, Evan.
That's a great point. And that's something we're seeing during the summertime. What are the biggest successes so far? The sequels: Inside Out 2, Bad Boys 4, Keen with the Planet of the Apes, a continuation of an existing franchise. What's not doing so well? It's The Fall Guy. Granted, that's part of an old TV show, but granted, pretty much original. Yeah. And that didn't do so well. Some of the movies earlier in the year also didn't do as well, but like Dune 2 did. Like, we're still seeing it in these years that the sequels, the IP, are the big successes. And that does, leading everything back to Pixar, it does give me, again, pause and nervousness where we're getting into like, what is Pete Docter going to learn from this? Yes, Inside Out 2 was a success, pretty much a guaranteed success. We talked about that again in our our preview episode. But like Inside Out 2 was like always going to be a success. Probably not as much as we thought it was going to be, as we now know it's going to be. But it was always going to be a success. But is Pixar going to rely on these sequels moving forward? You know, again, like I referenced it last time, but like Iger quickly, when he came back, he was like, boom, Toy Story 5, boom, Frozen 3, boom, Inside Out 2, Moana 2. It's like, that makes sense because they relied so heavily on streaming, kind of backfired. They weren't really ready for it and stuff like that. So now they're relying on sequels to kind of get them out of the hump. But the question is, are they going to continue relying on those sequels moving forward, or are they going to have enough faith to keep on changing the game? That's what early Pixar did. They changed the game. They're doing stuff about monsters, toys, robots in space. You know, Wall-E with just no languages, right? Or not a lot of English. So it's just like, that's what we want from Pixar. And hopefully that's what audiences want. But that's a tricky thing, like Orange Grove is saying, like audiences are picky. Are they going to be ready to accept other Pixar films, granted other animation films in general, if it's not what they want? And how do you market it to what they want? And how do you create stuff that they want? Yeah.
Well, and Evan, speaking of like what you were mentioning about like bringing back the sequels and everything. Well, first off, before I dive into that, OG, I could actually fix that issue when you say when you have little ones and they want like candy or popcorn. It's like, well, what is it like to want something? Here, eat your pretzel sticks.
There you go. There you go.
But as far as like with the sequels go, and Pete Docter actually addressed this. It's that, you know, they are looking into the sequels because of like how the characters are and the storyline, but they are also going to dive into original content, which after Inside Out 2 next year, they're going to, as we mentioned, they're going to have Elio. But then after Elio on March 6, 2026 is going to be another original film before Toy Story 5.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue actually, because that's our next Pete Docter quote that we're going to talk about. It says here, I want to ask you too about the Bloomberg article that came out recently. My takeaway was that fans were a little anxious about prioritizing sequels over storytelling. What do you want to impart to fans about the current state of Pixar? And Pete Docter here says, one thing that I think was slightly misinterpreted was the idea that we have to deliver more of what people know and maybe lean away from the personal. And actually, Evan, I think this is actually like kind of like a correction, or he's
what we were talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. He's trying to kind of like correct or like give maybe more context as to what we talked about in our last video. And he goes on to say here, all of that's true to some degree, but I think what we're always trying to do is find what are the universal things that everybody believes, both in terms of concepts and in terms of life experience. So for example, I thought as a kid, my toys came to life. I thought there were monsters that lived in the closet. We're looking for those kinds of big universal things that people go, quote, I already know that in a way, you know what I mean? There's a limited number. Oh, I'm sorry. We're looking for those kind of big universal things that people go, I already know that it's an original idea, but it's a concept that I had too, end quote. So it's kind of a sequel in a way. You know what I mean? There's a limited number of those. So they each have to be done in a very unique way through a special lens. We want to hold on to that, but we want to make sure they speak widely. Yeah. And here's the thing. It's so vital that Pixar and Disney Animation that they put a priority on originals, because you're never going to have another Frozen franchise. You're never going to have another Toy Story franchise if you don't take that risk with the new thing. Frozen at one point was the new thing, the untested franchise. When it came out in 2013, it turned out to be a huge phenomenon, right? You wouldn't have had that if you just relied on sequels and you never did anything new. So Pete Docter here is saying that, look, we're going to do originals. That's great. Hopefully his bosses agree with him. So
I still find qualms in this quote. Granted, I agree. He's like, for example, my toys came to life, monsters in my closet. Yes. But then there's still those direct quotes where you're saying you think those universal things aren't what was in Luca in Elemental, that they were more personal. But I still think they were personal. Yes, they were personal references to the director's childhoods, but they were also very universal. Everybody had a best friend growing up, i.e. Luca. Everybody grew up coming of age. You might not have been like a little girl coming of age, but everybody had that like nervousness to a significant other, that crush, that feeling of growing up and like physically and metaphorically changing. That puberty angle that Turning Red did, I think, really well.
I didn't. Obviously, I didn't grow up as a little girl, but I do have a lot of hair
really?
like a panda.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. I still take issue with what he's saying here because I feel like he's still missing the point here.
He still is like, well, I think we should prioritize like the toys and the monsters, but like Luca, Inside Out, they had that, or sorry, Luca and Turning Red, they had that stuff. They had that universal appeal. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
It was as universal as toys and as monsters.
Absolutely. You don't have to be Chinese to relate to what's going on in Turning Red. I mean, like you said, like coming of age, puberty, that whole awkward stage in life. Everyone can relate to that. You know what I'm saying? Luca, you're best.
And that's true because if you even go back even outside of Pixar, go back even to Disney animation. If we look at films like Mulan and Pocahontas, it's like, are we supposed to say, okay, because it's set in China or it's set, before the New World with Native Americans? It's like, but can we still find some equal balance of saying, hey, I know what it felt like to look at myself in the reflection and not like what I see. I want to be a person that makes a difference, in my life for my family and what have you. We could see a little bit of ourselves in that, but it just happens to be in the placement set of, in China or in a Native American tribe. It's like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like,
Well, it's like I've nobody has fallen in love with a beast, but that love story is relatable because it's at its core, everyone can relate to love. You know what I'm saying?
You haven't met my ex-wife.
Shots fired, George. But yeah,
you guys are so right. Those are fantastic examples from like classic Disney thing. I think what Walt Disney understood was that, the setting changes, the characters are changing. But something George Lucas was good with too is like everybody in the world can understand a mythological hero's or heroine's journey. And those are always going to be appealing no matter where the setting is. And I think the same thing here with Pixar. Like everybody can understand these universal aspects. And I think, again, I don't want to give Pete Docter shit. I don't think he means ill will towards these movies. I just don't think he missed the point about what they're talking about. Again, the whole notion, they're only saying this too because they think Turning Red and Luca, again, were not successful. But how were they not successful? They were critically well received. They were just on a streaming platform. It's like they were very successful. It's like, I don't know where this is coming from. The only argument I can understand is Elemental because that kind of didn't do great at the box office. But again, I blame Pixar and marketing for that. But yeah, so it's interesting. I do like that they're focusing on original storytelling. I just hope that they can market it correctly, and I hope that audiences are ready for it as well. And I mentioned this as well last time, but I think Pixar Animation and the reason why these budgets are so high, mostly I think OrangeNerd, I think you mentioned it, is because like they keep the stuff in-house, the staff in-house. They don't really do a lot of their overseas animation. Now, when I was doing the research for this podcast, it's that very much backs up the case where it's like it rises to that 200 million or that 150 to 200 million budget because of all the animation that goes into like the staff and all the stuff, keeping the stuff inside in studio, in contrast to an Illumination or DreamWorks, for example, which is very interesting. I still think Pixar can get into more unique animation styles. Maybe that might intrigue some people as well, like Spider-Verse. Even outside of being like Spider-Man fans, I think people were interested in a new form of animation. The reason Puss in Boots sequel did so well was even without the Puss in Boots IP, people saw the animation thing as well. We're like, okay, the animation's very cool. I want to see that. So I think hopefully Pixar can delve into that in terms of their changes moving forward.
Well, I hope so, Evan, because I feel like we've hit a ceiling now in terms of how real we can get CGI. Like we know how real that Pixar can do amazing things with CGI. They can make it basically look live action at this point. So now that we've hit that ceiling in terms of realism, let's play with some styles here. You know, you mentioned Puss in Boots. I love that style of animation. I wish Walt Disney Animation Studios would dip into that Puss in Boots style. It's a very like painted looking kind of style that works really well with like fairy tales and things. I think they were really smart. I think DreamWorks was smart to use that for Puss in Boots. But yeah, play with some different styles. You know, do like, you know, like what like Spider-Verse does. You know, have fun. You know,
Spider-Verse, Puss in Boots. Even I love this movie. What was it called? The one with the guy with the wolf, and they were like robbing stuff. I forget what it was called. Oh, The Bad Guys. The Bad Guys.
Oh, okay.
Loved that movie. I was so happy when it got nominated for an Oscar. I knew it wasn't going to win, but I'm like, Bad Guys is so good.
Yeah, I've never seen it. That was pretty good. That was DreamWorks, right?
I think it's on Peacock. So if you guys have Peacock, I think I would really recommend The Bad Guys.
I did see the previews of that. It was quite intriguing. I never like took the time to watch it, but
it's really fun. I had so much fun watching. I was very surprised by it. But yeah, great animation.
I do hope that you know Disney and Pixar can kind of find their own place again, because for a period of time, the animation had been looking so similar to one another. Right. You didn't know you didn't know if Brave was Pixar or Disney. You didn't know if Strange World was Disney or Pixar. You didn't even know if what Zootopia was. You know, because for me, there's certain movies like Zootopia that I think would fit better in the Pixar canon, you know, than Disney animation. You know, Brave seemed more like Disney animation than Pixar, you know, and it's, I do hope that, yeah, they can kind of dabble into like different kind of animation styles depending on like what the storyline is per movie.
Exactly. And that kind of reminds me, I did find a quote that was very interesting. I think one in the lead up to Inside Out 2, one of the reporters even asked, like, what is the future of Pixar? And Pete Docter answered it saying, there's tons of change. If you like change, it's very exciting. But if you're scared of change, you can still be excited, even though we're going into the unknown. The way we make films is constantly changing. The industry is constantly changing with the way that animation is constantly progressing. So I think I like him talking about like the technical side of it. Again, like the whole animation avenue is always changing. We're getting a lot of new things recently. Hopefully Pixar can do something unique in the years to follow as well.
Yeah, and I like that. I like that quote from him. The spirit of embracing change. That's a very Walt Disney sort of mindset, where, you know, Walt was always like next thing. You know, constantly moving. You know, okay, we did the first sound cartoon. Now let's do the first full length animated feature. Okay, I did that. Now let's build a theme park. You know, like he was always doing that. You know. And I like that mindset of like, you can't be scared of change, especially if you're going to be part of Disney. You got to embrace that change. You got to be excited for it. And the change isn't always going to be like good. You know, sometimes you might do something that's different or whatever, and it might fall flat, and that's fine. But it's better to try and fail than it is to play it safe and just, you know, never evolve. You got to grow.
And that's a great point. Like I give him shit for like Lightyear or Onward, but like I'm still glad he made those. Those are very interesting choices. Like if Lightyear was good, then I wouldn't be complaining as much. But like doing a science fiction take, okay, that's new for Pixar. That's interesting. It just didn't live up to my standards. But I like that they're constantly changing. They're doing stories on things that we wouldn't really even think about, and that's what Pixar's all about. So hopefully he continues that idea of just novelty in his movies.
Not for me. That was an hour and a half. I can't get back.
Yeah, it was a swing and a miss. You know, he swung.
Well, gentlemen, always fun talking shop with you guys. Really good time talking Pixar today. George, if you could remind everybody where they could find you on social media, sir.
Absolutely. You can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Disney George. You could also find me on Instagram under the Disney Italiano. And of course, you can find me right here on my home base at Orange Grove 55 with Citrus Corner, with all that sweet, juicy, but sometimes sticky Disney news and info.
There he is. And Evan, always a pleasure having you on the show, brother. We'll have you on again very soon. We got to get you on with Jay Shearer again. That was always fun.
I miss Jay. Jay's a great person. Love his takes.
Absolutely. If you could let everybody know where they can find you on social media.
Yeah, find me on Twitter, Harris EV9, as I'm always arguing with people about the Acolyte. No, I'm kidding.
Evan, it's so funny to me, right? Real quick. It's so funny to me when I hear people say Star Wars is dead. I go on Twitter and everyone's talking about Star Wars. I thought it was dead.
I thought it was dead too. I thought they were going to keep on watching it. What's happening? It's crazy to me. I don't know. It's weird. It's weird. But I am doing less arguing than I was like back in my early Twitter days where I was just like constantly arguing in these fandoms. Now I'm just like, oh, just mute and block. I don't care.
Yeah,
Especially with the amount of bots that I'm already blocking and muting bots all the time. I can mute the haters too. But anyways, find me again, Harris EV9. I'm doing a podcast with Nathan Rojas called Hyperspace Hype. Every week we're talking about the latest episode of Acolyte and the latest Star Wars news as well. Acolyte episode 4 just dropped. We have lots of thoughts, lots of theories. So we'll talk about that probably Friday or Saturday. Always talking about Star Wars movies. And we're also doing Fox Marvel commentaries. We're watching a lot of the Fox Marvel movies in the lead up to Deadpool versus Wolverine, or Deadpool and Wolverine, whatever it's freaking called. And we just watched Fantastic Four, the 2015 version. Not great, Bob, but it was a fun experience. The ending of that movie is one of the most unintentionally funny moments in cinema history. Like, what should we call ourselves? Like, oh, we were pretty fantastic, right? It's like, oh yeah, good idea. It's comedy. So yeah, check out our channel for all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Links down below. Make sure you support Evan and Nathan over there. They do fantastic work. Again, in the description, you'll find all the details. Thank you all so much for watching this episode of the Orange Nerd Show, and until the next time.